In 1941, the United States actively began developing jet engines for aviation. Three major companies took on this formidable task. These were Allis-Chalmers, Westinghouse, and General Electric. They were all part of a special group known as the Durand Committee. The first two companies were designing engines for the Navy. Meanwhile, General Electric was building the TG-100 turboprop engine specifically for the Army Air Forces. But there was one major problem. None of these companies had practical experience building gas turbine engines for aircraft. Until then, their main focus had been on heavy industrial turbines. Due to this lack of aviation experience, progress was painfully slow. Naturally, this frustrated the military brass, who needed results yesterday. Things changed in April 1941, when the commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, Henry Arnold, visited Great Britain. While there, he was shown the latest British jet aircraft from Gloucester, the G-40. Witnessing this highly classified aircraft in flight absolutely blew the American general away. After a series of negotiations with the British, General Arnold managed to secure permission. He was allowed to bring the blueprints for the revolutionary jet engine of engineer Frank Whittle back to the States. The goal was to start mass-producing them in America. All of this priceless documentation was immediately handed over to General Electric. The company already had strong ties to aviation, specifically in its turbo-supercharger division. Just 7 months later, on March 18, 1942, the first American engine was ready for test stand runs. It was designated the General Electric IA. With a reliable engine in hand, the military could finally give the green light. They could now develop full-fledged jet combat aircraft. In June 1943, the United States Army Air Forces approached leading aircraft manufacturers. They presented them with an ambitious new challenge. They needed a multi-engine jet aircraft. It had to be capable of serving as both a high-speed reconnaissance platform and a heavy bomber. Later, on November 17, 1944, the military issued clear technical requirements for this future aircraft. The specs seemed like pure science fiction for the time. The aircraft had to cover a range of over 3,000 nautical miles. It also needed to climb to an altitude of 45,000 feet and hit a top speed of around 480 knots. One of the companies that took on this incredibly complex project was aviation giant Boeing. At that time, their engineers already had some groundwork laid for a jet bomber. This was under the company designation Model 424. Visually, it looked like a scaled-down version of the legendary B-29 piston engine bomber. However, it was powered by 4 jet engines. These were housed in 2 streamlined pods slung under the wings. Wind tunnel testing, however, brought a harsh reality check. Mounting the engines this way disrupted the airflow over the wing. This severely degraded the aerodynamic performance of the aircraft. In December 1944, Boeing completely reworked the concept and introduced the Model 432. In this iteration, engineers buried all 4 engines directly inside the fuselage. This instantly solved the airflow issues over the wing. The engines were positioned along the fuselage center line. The air intakes were moved forward near the cockpit, while the exhaust nozzles exited the tail section. Despite these major internal changes, the new Model 432 still looked a lot like the venerable B-29 from the outside. The only difference was a slightly thinner airfoil. When Army Air Forces representatives reviewed the updated design, they saw massive potential. They immediately began negotiations with Boeing's management. They wanted to sign an official contract for the full-scale development of the aircraft. Under this agreement, the new bomber was officially designated the B-47, but the military wanted to hedge their bets, so they simultaneously awarded similar contracts to Boeing's main competitors. North American was tasked with developing their own jet bomber, which became the B-45. Convair got to work on their B-46 project, and Martin started developing the B-48. In May 1945, a special U.S. Army scientific advisory group headed to Europe. Their mission was to investigate captured German aviation factories and secret labs. This mission was led by Theodor von Karman. He was a prominent aerodynamicist, a Caltech professor, and a leading specialist at Northrop. The main goal for the U.S. team was to find breakthrough ideas or technologies. They wanted to quickly adapt these for U.S. aircraft programs. Working alongside the scientists in this group was George Scherer. He was the head of the aerodynamics department at Boeing. While digging through the archives of a German research center, he stumbled upon scientific reports. These reports dated back to the mid-1930s. These documents detailed the use of a swept wing. This design allowed for a radical increase in the flight speed of an aircraft. Realizing the unbelievable potential hidden in these blueprints, Scherer wasted no time. He sent an urgent telegram back to Boeing headquarters. The message contained a single word: stop. Boeing reacted instantly, halting all work on the B-47 bomber. This aircraft originally featured a conventional straight wing. After Scherer returned, wind tunnel tests fully validated the conclusions of the German specialists. As a result, the B-47 project was immediately redesigned around a swept wing. In September 1945, Boeing engineers finished the necessary calculations for the revamped B-47. This version received the internal designation Model 448. The design team decided to use the fuselage from the earlier Model 432. However, they paired it with a completely new and thin wing with a 35-degree sweep. They also added 2 more jet engines to the design. All 4 of the main engines were still buried inside the fuselage at the time. Their air intakes were moved to the very nose of the aircraft. However, the military rejected this concept. They correctly determined that burying jet engines inside the fuselage was a severe fire hazard. So, the Army Air Forces laid down a strict requirement. The power plants had to be mounted externally. Additionally, this configuration would make future repairs and maintenance significantly easier. By October, the company proposed an updated version known as Model 450. In this design, all 6 jet engines were housed in podded nacelles suspended under the wings. This time, the military was thrilled and quickly gave the project the green light. In late autumn of that same year, the wingspan of the new aircraft was increased to 116 feet. The engine mounting points were also slightly adjusted. By April, the Army Air Forces ordered 2 prototypes for the B-47 program. These early testbeds were not equipped with any navigation or bombing gear. Their sole purpose was purely to conduct flight tests and evaluate the airframe. Construction of a full-scale mock-up of the B-47 was completed in April 1946. When an inspection board reviewed it, they requested several major modifications. Specifically, Boeing was asked to reposition the co-pilot seat and completely redesign the landing gear. Assembly of the first prototype began in the summer of 1946. But progress was incredibly slow. Development was bogged down by constant debates over the landing gear design. This was accompanied by the headache of figuring out where to mount the engines. The issue was that the new swept wing was so aerodynamically thin. There was just no way to house massive main landing gear struts inside it. The engineers had to get creative, so they went with a bicycle landing gear configuration. This meant the forward and aft main gear struts were mounted in tandem, directly along the center line of the fuselage. And to keep the massive aircraft from tipping over, they added small outrigger wheels retracting into the inboard engine nacelles. These wheels retracted during flight. But they did a great job stabilizing the bomber during takeoff, landing, and taxiing. However, this bicycle setup created a new problem. During the takeoff roll, the pilot physically could not rotate the nose of the aircraft just by pulling back on the yoke. For the bomber to even get airborne, it had to sit on the ground at its required takeoff angle of attack. To pull this off, they lengthened the forward main gear strut. They also mounted the wing at an angle of incidence of almost 21 degrees. But even these workarounds did not help much. The takeoff and landing performance of the B-47 turned out to be downright poor. Just to get off the ground, the aircraft needed a runway over 6,300 feet long. This severely limited the number of airfields it could operate from. And there was a real threat that the military would simply cancel the project. To save the bomber, the designers took a radical step. They sacrificed internal fuselage space to install 18 solid-fuel JATO rockets. Each of them produced about 1,000 pounds of thrust. A JATO-assisted takeoff was absolutely spectacular. Later on, lifting off, trailing a massive cloud of thick white smoke, the B-47 would become the star of airshows all across the United States. To shorten the landing roll, the cutting-edge wing was equipped with a set of Fowler flaps. When deployed, they would first slide aft and only then extend downward. but even these could not effectively slow down the heavy aircraft. So Boeing engineers took a page from German World War II research. They integrated a drag chute into the tail section of the fuselage. It is also worth noting the thin, swept wing itself, which was incredibly flexible for its time. Just imagine this. Under its own weight on the ground, the wingtips could droop by a full 5 feet. At first, designers worried that this extreme flexibility would lead to a loss of control in flight. They also thought it would interfere with aileron effectiveness. To play it safe, they added spoilers acting as air brakes on the upper surface of the wings on the B-47. However, during actual flight testing, it turned out these fears were unfounded. The ailerons did their job perfectly at any speed, so these extra control surfaces were left off the production versions of the bomber. Flying this aircraft required a crew of 4. The crew consisted of a pilot, co-pilot, gunner, and navigator. The navigator had the most critical job of all. This involved precise targeting and actually releasing the payload. The engineers placed the pilot and co-pilot in a tandem seating arrangement. They enclosed them under a single transparent bubble canopy. This looked a lot like the design of agile fighters from that era. The navigator, on the other hand, was positioned right in the nose of the aircraft. They were housed in a transparent nose cone that provided an incredible field of view. Engineers spent a considerable amount of time running complex calculations and countless experiments to figure out the ideal defensive armament for the new bomber. The research revealed an interesting picture. At extreme altitudes of nearly 46,000 feet, enemy fighters could only attack the B-47 in 2 narrow, cone-shaped zones. These zones extended roughly 3,700 feet out from the nose and tail of the aircraft. The math of aerial combat was unforgiving. Even if ground radar perfectly guided an enemy fighter to the target and its pilot spotted the bomber from 2 nautical miles away, he would still need time to maneuver. By the time the fighter turned around for a clean attack run, the high-speed B-47 would already be almost 6 nautical miles away, putting it completely out of reach. These theoretical calculations were later proven in practice when Soviet interceptors repeatedly but fruitlessly tried to catch the bomber. Nearly all attempts by Soviet pilots ended in failure. Relying on this speed advantage, the designers decided not to weigh the bomber down and installed just 2 50-caliber machine guns in the tail. Originally, they wanted to install a fully manned tail turret with a separate gunner station. However, the narrow, streamlined fuselage of the bomber simply did not have the space for it. Instead, they developed an innovative, remotely controlled tail turret, which ultimately went into production. Boeing rolled out the first prototype, designated the B-47, at its Seattle plant on September 12, 1947. This ambitious bomber was powered by 6 J-35 GE-7 turbojet engines. Each engine produced 3,630 pounds of thrust. The new bomber was officially named the Stratojet. The prototype took to the air for the first time on December 17, 1947. Veteran test pilots Bob Robbins and Scott Osler were at the controls for its historic maiden flight. They successfully flew the prototype to the nearby Moses Lake Air Force Base. This base had a much longer runway, making it safer for this kind of flight testing. During its initial flight test program, the first B-47 logged about 83 hours in the air. For nearly half of those hours, Air Force test pilots were at the controls. A detailed evaluation of the new bomber took place at Muroc Air Force Base in the summer of 1948. While the company pilots at Boeing were thrilled with the handling and performance of the B-47, the Air Force was not entirely convinced. Air Force representatives noted that the B-47 was about 65 knots faster than its straight-wing competitor, the Martin XB-48. However, it still fell short of their target specifications. On top of that, its service ceiling was 2,500 feet lower than what Boeing had projected. It was also a full 7,500 feet lower than what the military required. To address these shortcomings, they decided to equip the second B-47 prototype with much more powerful engines. It was fitted with J-47 GE-3 turbojets, pushing the thrust up to 5,000 pounds each. The upgraded aircraft took to the skies for the first time on July 21, 1948. The engine swap paid off. The top speed of the bomber jumped dramatically, reaching around 525 knots. Given this massive boost in performance, the first XB-47 prototype was also retrofitted with these upgraded engines in the fall of 1949. In early September 1948, Air Force leadership finally settled on a location for full-scale production. The main Seattle plant was operating at full capacity, building KC-97 aerial tankers and B-50 heavy bombers. So, assembly of the new jet aircraft was moved to the Boeing facility in Wichita, Kansas. At first, the Air Force played it safe. That fall, they ordered an initial batch of just 10 B-47A models. But by mid-November, their requirements had grown significantly. They added another 88 B-47B bombers to the order. From there, the contracts were in constant flux. The Pentagon would add aircraft to the order 1 minute, then they would cut them the next. Eventually, after all the bureaucratic back and forth, the total number of aircraft on order just kept climbing. This guaranteed the plant a massive production backlog. Right around this time, the U.S. military started adopting a new, comprehensive approach to weapon systems development. The Stratojet became the first aircraft in history to be developed as a single major weapon system. It was designed in 2 distinct variants right from the start. These were a conventional bomber and a dedicated reconnaissance platform. Then, on February 8, 1949, the first XB-47 prototype turned heads. It set an unofficial speed record during a transcontinental flight. The aircraft flew roughly 2,000 nautical miles. It went all the way from Moses Lake to Andrews Air Force Base. During the flight, it maintained a staggering average speed of around 525 knots. The pilots were not just pushing the envelope for fun, though. Andrews was hosting a major equipment demonstration. This was for influential members of the Armed Services Committee. Back then, any high-profile achievement or record set right in front of politicians was vital. It could instantly translate into a massive boost in funding and new orders. As a result of these successful demonstrations, the delivery of that first batch of 10 B-47A models to operational squadrons was scheduled. It was planned between April and November 1950. This kicked off a completely new era in strategic aviation. The B-47A made its first flight on June 25, 1950. This bomber was powered by 6 General Electric J-47 GE-11 engines. Each produced around 5,200 pounds of thrust. Compared to earlier experimental models, the gross weight had shot up significantly. It went from 121,000 to over 151,000 pounds. However, it is worth noting that the B-47A was not a combat-ready aircraft just yet. Its main job was strictly to continue the flight test program and refine the platform. The early days of operating the B-47 were plagued by a series of crashes and tragic incidents. Because of this grim trend, the aircraft even earned an ominous nickname. They called it the crew killer. The main issue was that it was incredibly difficult to land. The aircraft was completely unforgiving of pilot error. However, if you look at the stats, about 55% of all B-47 accidents actually came down to human error. These were mistakes made by the pilots or maintenance crews. The issues were not fully ironed out until closer to 1954. By then, the accident rate had dropped significantly. The B-47 was considered just about the most reliable jet in the U.S. Air Force inventory. As aviation historians have noted, this bomber was often admired and deeply respected. It was sometimes cursed or outright feared, but it was never truly loved. During the operation of these early models, another major flaw reared its head. The drag chutes, measuring 32 feet in diameter, simply were not strong enough. The standard fabric would just tear apart. It was unable to handle the massive stress of slowing down such a heavy aircraft. The solution was elegant. Engineers switched to using ribbon chutes. This was a design originally developed by German engineers. Landing the B-47 was notoriously difficult. The J-47 turbojets had terrible throttle response. This created a major flight hazard. Pilots dreaded pulling the throttles back to idle on short final. They knew full well that if they had to execute a go-around, the engines would not spool up in time to provide the necessary thrust. To fix this, Boeing engineers came up with an unconventional workaround. They installed a 16-foot approach chute in the tail section. The idea was to deploy it while still on the approach. The chute created drag. This allowed the pilot to fly at lower speeds while keeping the engine RPM up. If they needed to abort the landing, the pilot would simply jettison the chute. Then they would push the throttles forward and immediately climb away on full power. Equally critical issues plagued the escape system, specifically the ejection seats on the B-47A variant. After a fatal emergency bailout from the experimental B-47, the Air Force made a drastic decision. The ejection seats were completely removed from the aircraft. This left the crews to bail out manually. Production and deliveries of the B-47A wrapped up in May 1951. Once the testing program concluded, these aircraft were sent to MacDill Air Force Base in Florida. There, the local bomber wing took on the massive task of transitioning Strategic Air Command crews to the new jet. Interestingly, the vast majority of these early airframes were not combat ready. For instance, the specialized K-2 bombing and navigation system was only installed on about 40% of the fleet. The A-2 automatic tail defense system made its way onto just a single airframe. Meanwhile, another was used as a testbed for the experimental A-5 system. The next variant, the B-47B, had been proposed to the Air Force as early as November 1949. Under the initial contract, the Air Force was slated to receive 87 of these aircraft. This was scheduled to happen between late 1950 and the end of 1951. The upgraded B-47B featured a significantly reinforced airframe. This bumped its maximum takeoff weight up to an impressive 200,000 pounds. Engineers also improved crew visibility. They achieved this by applying an innovative water-repellent coating and an electrical heating system to the windscreen. This allowed them to completely eliminate the old, unreliable mechanical wipers. On the avionics front, instead of the previous tail defense setup, they attempted to integrate the new B-4 radar-directed fire control system. In practice, however, it proved to be unreliable on most of the airframes. On later production blocks, Boeing introduced the more advanced K-4A bombing and navigation system. This featured a periscopic bomb sight housed in a redesigned nose section. The avionics suite was further upgraded with new radar warning receivers and electronic countermeasures. While the actual length of the bomb bay was slightly reduced, the B-47B could still carry up to 18,000 pounds of ordnance. This payload included both conventional and nuclear weapons. Just like the previous variant, ejection seats were left out of this aircraft as well. In an emergency, the crew had to bail out the old-fashioned way. They did this by manually jumping through the main entry hatch. To give the crew a better chance of surviving the bailout, engineers installed an aerodynamic wind deflector just forward of the hatch. This shielded them from the severe slipstream. The outbreak of the Korean War served as a massive catalyst. It sharply drove up demand for the B-47 bomber. To meet this demand and ramp up production, the Air Force revived the manufacturing alliance between Boeing, Lockheed, and Douglas. This was the exact same trio that had successfully teamed up to build the legendary B-17 Flying Fortress during World War II. Lockheed dedicated its massive Marietta, Georgia plant to building the B-47. The complex had been shuttered after World War II, but it reopened its doors in January 1951. Initially, they refurbished pressurized cabins for B-29 superfortresses. These were being pulled out of storage for the Korean conflict. Later, they stood up full-scale production lines for brand-new Stratojets. Meanwhile, Douglas was assembling its own B-47 bombers in Tulsa, Oklahoma. At the same time, Boeing kept its massive production lines running in Wichita and Seattle. When the Air Force took delivery of the first B-47B models in March 1951, they were in for a major disappointment. During inspection, the evaluation board flat-out rejected the bombers. They cited over 2,000 separate defects. The aircraft turned out to be overweight. It was incredibly difficult to handle and highly unstable at high altitudes. But despite this staggering number of flaws, the Air Force desperately needed the new jets. By November 1951, a massive contract was signed with Boeing for 445 Stratojets. That figure was later scaled back to 395 aircraft. The biggest and arguably most terrifying oversight by Boeing designers was the lack of proper ejection seats for the crew. Even under ideal conditions, using a wind deflector, trying to bail out through the standard escape hatch meant almost certain death. Because of this, pilots were understandably terrified to get behind the controls of a B-47. In mid-1950, the top brass issued a strict directive to install ejection seats immediately. However, mass production was already in full swing. This made instant design changes impossible. As a result, life-saving ejection seats would not actually appear on the bomber until the 400th airframe rolled off the assembly line. The K-2 bombing and navigation system also turned out to be a massive headache. It was notoriously unreliable. To put it in perspective, the system relied on 370 vacuum tubes and around 20,000 individual parts. To make matters worse, the components of this complex system were scattered seemingly at random throughout the aircraft. This turned basic troubleshooting and routine maintenance into an absolute nightmare for ground crews. They attempted to upgrade the system in mid-1952, but the much-needed miracle never materialized. The tail defense systems of the aircraft, both the early A-2 and the upgraded A-5, were plagued with glitches and constantly acted up. To keep the bombers combat ready, engineers implemented a stopgap measure. They equipped the B-47 with the time-tested N6 optical sight. Gradually, the aircraft saw improvements. Starting with the 89th B-47B airframe, Boeing began installing more powerful J-47 GE-23 engines. These put out 5,820 pounds of thrust. The true backbone of the fleet and the definitive production version of the Stratojet was the B-47E. This model became the most widely produced variant. A total of 1,341 were built through the joint efforts of the three aviation giants. Lockheed built 386 aircraft, Douglas assembled 264, and Boeing rolled out 691. This version received a series of major upgrades that significantly improved the aircraft. First off, proper ejection seats were finally installed for all crew members. The navigator now ejected downward. Secondly, that finicky K-2 navigation system was swapped out for the much more reliable K-4. The internal solid rocket boosters were removed and replaced with externally mounted ones. The heart of the bomber featured new J-47 GE-25 engines. These were equipped with a water injection system, allowing for short bursts of up to 7,210 pounds of thrust. On top of that, the twin-tail machine guns were replaced with hard-hitting 20mm cannons. In January 1952, a massive modernization program kicked off. The Air Force decided to bring all the older B-47B aircraft up to the new B-47E standard. This painstaking process dragged on all the way into early 1956. These upgraded bombers were sometimes unofficially called the B-47B2. The only real difference between them and a brand new B-47E was their serial numbers. The B-47E variant also made history as the first Stratojet equipped with an in-flight refueling system utilizing the flying boom. The refueling receptacle was located on the right side of the forward fuselage. This mid-air refueling capability allowed them to reduce the total internal and external fuel capacity of the aircraft down to around 95,000 pounds. The massive external drop tanks held roughly 11,000 pounds of fuel each. They were built from tough stainless steel and mounted under the wings between the engine nacelles. Here is a fascinating and somewhat chilling Cold War detail. The lower fuselage and all horizontal control surfaces of these bombers were painted anti-flash white. This was done to reflect the deadly thermal radiation from a nuclear blast. Eventually, some of the older B-47B models also received this protective paint job. The new B-47E bomber made its first flight on January 30, 1953. By the very next month, this powerful aircraft was officially accepted into service. In April of that same year, the first production models began arriving at combat units. This included a bomb wing out at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in sweltering Arizona. Shortly after, these brand new Stratojets joined the ranks of another wing at March Air Force Base in sunny California. Very quickly, the B-47E became the true backbone of Strategic Air Command Bomber Force. The pace of its deployment was simply staggering. While the Air Force had 8 fully equipped wings by the end of 1953, exactly 1 year later, that number jumped to 17. By early 1956, that figure reached 22. The program hit its absolute peak in December 1956. By then, a massive 27 wings were sitting at full combat readiness. They were fielding well over 1,200 aircraft. In total, 1,306 of these strategic bombers rolled off the assembly line during the entire production run. Over time, the design of the aircraft saw continuous improvements. Right in the middle of the production run, engineers decided to fit the bombers with new, significantly beefed-up landing gear struts. Within the Air Force, this upgraded version picked up the unofficial designation B-47E2. The first of these updated bombers started reaching frontline units as early as August 1953. Eventually, Boeing went even further, rolling out the B-47E4 variant with beefed-up landing gear. This so-called Dash 4 packed some serious avionics. It featured the new MA-7A airborne radar, an advanced ANAP-S54 radar warning receiver, and a specialized ANAPG-39 gun-laying radar. With all these upgrades, the maximum takeoff weight of the aircraft ballooned to a staggering 230,000 pounds. This overshot initial estimates by almost 3,000 pounds. Most of that extra weight came from a massive increase in fuel capacity. But as a trade-off, the combat radius of the bomber stretched to 2,500 nautical miles. This was almost double what the early B-47A could manage just 5 years prior. In early 1955, Strategic Air Command handed Boeing a new requirement. The B-47 airframe desperately needed structural reinforcement. This was driven by a shift to an aggressive, radically new toss bombing tactic that utilized a half-loop maneuver. This high-stress maneuver allowed the bomber to rapidly reverse course. It also put a safe distance between the aircraft and ground zero. In the summer of 1955, Air Force crews successfully released a 6,005-pound dummy nuclear weapon for the first time using this technique. During the pull-up, the G loading on the airframe and crew peaked at 2.6 Gs. The follow-up test pushed the envelope even further. Pulling 2.5 Gs, the crew lobbed a massive dummy shape. It weighed a staggering 8,858 pounds. But those extreme aerodynamic loads took their toll. In April 1958, during a routine phase inspection, maintainers discovered severe fatigue cracking in the B-47 wings. This grim discovery forced the Air Force to urgently launch a massive structural reinforcement initiative. It was known as Project Milk Bottle. The extensive fleet-wide modifications were successfully completed by the summer of 1959. The final production model of the legendary B-47 was officially delivered to the Air Force on February 18, 1957. This specific aircraft entered operational service with a bomb wing. The wing was stationed at Pease Air Force Base in New Hampshire. Aviation technology was advancing rapidly. By 1957, the Air Force had already started phasing out the B-47. They favored the much heavier and more capable B-52 Stratofortress. In the spring of 1961, President John F. Kennedy directed the military to accelerate the Stratojet retirement from the active inventory. However, escalating Cold War tensions forced the Pentagon to hit the brakes on the drawdown. This was specifically due to the Berlin crisis of 1961. Ultimately, the last operational B-47 bomber was not flown to the boneyard for storage until February 11, 1966. It is also worth noting that beyond its primary role as a strategic bomber, the Stratojet spawned several fascinating specialized variants. Take the EB-47E, for example. The Navy actually acquired 2 of these airframes on loan. Engineers removed the standard underwing drop tanks. They replaced them with massive pods packed with advanced electronic warfare gear. Interestingly enough, these 2 specific aircraft ended up seeing the longest service lives of any Stratojets. In fact, one of them holds the distinction of being the very last B-47 to fly in the United States. It was finally flown to its well-deserved retirement at an aviation museum in Colorado in the late 1970s. Then there is the EB-47L. In 1963, 36 Standard Line bombers were converted into airborne communications relay platforms. Their mission was to ensure uninterrupted command and control during a global nuclear exchange. The ERB-47H was a top-secret electronic intelligence variant. Only 3 were ever built. They were heavily modified from the standard RB-47H reconnaissance airframe. These crews flew some of the most highly classified and dangerous missions directly along the edges of hostile airspace. Finally, the ETB-47E. In the late 50s, as the early airframes began showing their age, several were converted into dedicated trainers. This was done to prepare the next generation of bomber crews. Finally, there was the experimental B-47G. In early 1953, 2 aircraft were used to test the newly developed probe and drogue aerial refueling system. One aircraft acted as the tanker, while the receiver was designated the YB-47F. These tests were necessary simply because the Air Force lacked high-speed jet tankers at the time. Ultimately, the problem was solved more pragmatically. They added 2 jet pods to the older propeller-driven KB-50 tankers. By the summer of 1957, the experimental jet tanker program was canceled. Imagine a massive bomber flying without a crew. That was exactly the case with the B-47E. The Air Force took 14 standard B-47E models and converted them into full-scale radio-controlled target drones. Their primary role was to serve as flying targets. They were used for testing the new Boeing surface-to-air missiles. Typically, the missiles were programmed for a near miss to avoid destroying the aircraft. But during one test, something went wrong. A direct hit blew one of these unique drones to pieces. In the spring of 1951, the RB-47B variant appeared, a dedicated photo reconnaissance aircraft. Instead of bombs, its bomb bay was fitted with 8 high-resolution cameras. However, the aircraft had a major limitation. It was completely blind at night and in bad weather. This restricted it to daytime, clear sky missions. Only 26 of these aircraft were produced. The next step was the RB-47E, which proved to be far more successful. An impressive 255 of these reconnaissance aircraft were built. Compared to the standard B-47E, its nose was stretched by 34 inches to house the necessary equipment. For shorter takeoff rolls, designers added a built-in JATO system. Instead of weapons, it carried an entire optical payload. This included 11 modern cameras and 10 photoflash bombs. This allowed it to capture high-quality night photography. To maximize its range, its fuel capacity was increased to around 120,000 pounds. The RB-47E made its maiden flight in the summer of 1953. The final 15 airframes of this production run were fitted with advanced all-weather equipment. They were given a new designation, the RB-47K. The RB-47H variant was a dedicated electronic intelligence, or ELINT, platform. Instead of cameras, the former bomb bay was packed with complex electronics. This included radar signal analyzers and powerful transmitters for electronic countermeasures. The first of these aircraft arrived at Forbes Air Force Base in Kansas in the late summer of 1955. Air Force crews gave them a fitting nickname, the Ravens. A total of 35 RB-47H aircraft were built. They flew some of the most daring missions of the Cold War. They frequently probed Soviet airspace to gather top-secret signals intelligence. The last of these electronic reconnaissance platforms was not retired until late 1967. To safely transition new pilots and navigators to the aircraft, a dedicated trainer variant was introduced, designated the TB-47B. It provided a safer environment for rookie crews. This helped mitigate mistakes that could have been fatal in a frontline bomber. One of the most fascinating chapters in the history of the B-47 was the WB-47B weather reconnaissance model. It was developed at the direct request of the United States Congress following a devastating hurricane in 1954. This aircraft routinely did what few pilots would dare. It flew directly into the eyes of typhoons and hurricanes to gather meteorological data. Later on, the WB-47B even worked in tandem with the TIROS-2 weather satellite. After logging over 126 flight hours in brutal storm conditions, the aircraft was honorably retired and sent to the scrapyard in 1963. Continuing the weather reconnaissance mission was the WB-47E, a dedicated weather ship for the Air Force. 34 were built in total, and they took on some pretty harrowing work. They flew directly into radioactive clouds to collect air samples after nuclear tests. The nose section of these aircraft housed a special television camera. This camera captured the formation of the infamous mushroom clouds in incredible detail. By 1965, these daring aircraft were replaced by the new WC-130 Hercules. Back in the late 1940s, the Air Force envisioned a turboprop-powered strategic bomber capable of extreme intercontinental ranges. To test this concept, two standard B-47B models were converted into dedicated flying testbeds designated the XB-47D. The configuration was pretty unique. The outer J-47 GE-23 turbojets were left in place. However, massive YT-49W1 turboprops were mounted on the inner pylons. These cranked out 9,710 shaft horsepower. These engines drove huge 15-foot four-bladed propellers. Their blades resembled massive oars 24 inches wide. The project fell way behind schedule. The new turboprops proved finicky. They took a long time to pass mandatory ground reliability runs. It was not until August 1955 that the first XB-47D finally took to the skies. It was followed by its sister ship in early 1956. Despite engineering concerns, the test flights went surprisingly smoothly. There was not a single major incident. In fact, the experimental aircraft managed to reach a blistering 520 knots. At the time, this was the absolute level flight speed record for a propeller-driven aircraft. The B-47 family tree also includes a true one-off. This is the YB-47J. This unique airframe was used strictly as a flight testbed. It tested a state-of-the-art bombsight system. The U.S. Air Force was also more than willing to support Allied programs. In 1956, a B-47B was temporarily loaned to the Royal Canadian Air Force. The Canadians needed a reliable testbed for their new Iroquois turbojet. This engine was being developed for the brand new CF-105 Interceptor. They mounted this extra engine in a pod. It was strapped directly to the right side of the rear fuselage. After logging 31 flight hours with this asymmetrical setup, the Stratojet was returned to the United States. Finally, we have to mention the YDB-47B variant. Back in 1949, Boeing modified two production Stratojets. They served as launch platforms for the new GAM-63 Rascal standoff missile. This opened up a whole new chapter in the history of aerial warfare. Developed by Bell Aircraft, the GAM-63 was based on the experimental X-6 missile. It essentially served as a massively scaled-up version. The weapon got its name Rascal as an acronym for Radar Scanning Link. This referred to its radar command guidance system. Aerodynamically, the missile featured a cruciform wing fitted with ailerons. Its flight path was steered by upper and lower nose canards. Powering the missile was a massive three-chamber liquid propellant rocket engine. It ran on a highly volatile mix of nitric acid and JP-4 jet fuel. It cranked out over 4,000 pounds of thrust. The sheer size of the weapon was staggering. It measured nearly 32 feet long and 4 feet in diameter. It had a wingspan of about 17 feet. At drop, this behemoth weighed in at nearly 13,450 pounds. The GAM-63 could climb to an extreme altitude of 85,300 feet. It could hit speeds around 870 knots. All of this was done while offering a maximum standoff range of about 65 nautical miles. This missile was air-launched for the very first time on September 30th, 1952. For this historic test, they used a DB-50D bomber. Later on, for the B-47 series, the missile was mounted directly onto the right side of the fuselage. The first launch from the upgraded YDB-47E carrier aircraft took place in the mid-summer of 1955. Toward the end of 1957, crews from the 321st Bomb Wing were actively training on two of these missile carriers. On October 30th of that same year, the new weapon officially entered service. Top brass had some ambitious plans to arm the entire 445th Bomb Squadron with these missiles. However, history had other plans. On September 9, 1958, the production program was suddenly scrapped. The main reason behind this decision was the incredibly poor reliability of the weapon. More importantly, it had abysmal accuracy. During testing, the missile would miss its intended target by nearly 1,500 feet. All in all, they only managed to conduct 64 test launches. The YDB-47B aircraft also found a role in other equally fascinating projects. They served as flight test platforms for two stage air-launched ballistic missiles. These were built by the Martin Company. These tests were carried out under the Bold Orion program. It was during this very project on October 13, 1959, that the military made a daring attempt. They tried to intercept the Explorer 6 satellite. This satellite was orbiting at an altitude of roughly 125 nautical miles above the Earth. According to telemetry data, the interceptor missile flew incredibly close. It passed just 3 nautical miles away from the satellite. But let us jump back in time a bit to 1949. Back then, the Air Force kicked off research under a highly classified program. The main goal was to design a specialized aircraft capable of carrying a massive hydrogen bomb. At the time, engineers seriously believed this. The colossal blast radius of a weapon like that was guaranteed to destroy the drop aircraft. Because of this, the only logical delivery system they could settle on was a remote-controlled bomber. In early 1950, a strategic decision was made to convert 10 conventional B-47 bombers into drones. It was expected that the first of these aircraft would enter service as early as 1951. This unique modification was given the designation MB-47. In April of that same year, the ambitious project was codenamed Project Brass Ring. At first, the concept worked like this. The MB-47 bomber would take off, refuel in midair, and fly toward the target under the control of human pilots. Later, while still over friendly territory, the crew would eject. This left the aircraft to fly the rest of the way on autopilot, guided by a complex celestial navigation system. But the military quickly realized this setup was just too limited. The drone would need to pull off complex maneuvers to dodge enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. This required much more flexible control. So, the developers added another element to the mix. They introduced a director aircraft, the DB-47. Its job was to fly behind and control the drone via a radio command link all the way to the target. This idea seemed like the way to go, and Boeing was contracted to develop both aircraft. North American, Sperry, and Collins later joined the project. North American developed an ultra-precise navigation system. Sperry handled the autopilot, and Collins built a reliable radio command and control system. But the conclusion to this massive undertaking turned out to be pretty unexpected. None of these innovative systems were actually ever finished. Military engineers found a much simpler and more effective solution. They just equipped the hydrogen bomb with a massive retarding parachute. This slowed its fall significantly. It gave a regular manned bomber enough precious time to escape at top speed to a safe distance from the blast radius. Once they figured this out, all work on the highly classified brass ring program was completely canceled on April 1, 1953. Perhaps the most famous pilot to ever fly the B-47 Stratojet was Captain John Lapo. Thanks to one incredibly risky stunt, he earned a reputation as a true aviation daredevil and became an American legend. It all started late at night on April 24, 1959. Captain Lapo took off on what was supposed to be a completely routine training flight. It was mainly to practice celestial navigation and simulated bomb runs. The crew nailed the mission, and by early morning, the massive swept wing bomber was cruising back to home base. Flying over Lake Michigan, Lapo decided to pull off something absolutely no one saw coming. He dropped his RB-47E down to an altitude of just 75 feet off the deck. He went barreling right under the famous Mackinac suspension bridge. It was unbelievably dangerous. The tip of the vertical stabilizer cleared the underside of the bridge by a mere 65 feet. The co-pilot, who had known his unpredictable aircraft commander for years, took it in stride and stayed calm. You could not say the same for the brand new navigator, though. At first, he was on the intercom in a total panic, begging Captain Lapo to abort the insane stunt. When begging did not work, the young officer, according to the rest of the crew, simply froze in pure shock. The second the bomber shot out from under the bridge, Lapo firewalled the throttles. He pulled into a steep climb, rocketing back up to a safe altitude. Naturally, the top brass found out about the stunt right after the aircraft touched down. Lapo was immediately turned in by that same terrified navigator. As it later turned out, this navigator was the son of a high-ranking general. But there was no keeping a lid on the story. Details of the reckless fly-under quickly leaked to the press. This was thanks to an officer at Elmendorf Air Force Base. The man who managed to thread a massive strategic bomber under the suspension bridge instantly became a folk hero. Later, while talking to reporters, the pilot admitted his real dream. It had always been to fly under the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. The Air Force brass was absolutely furious at the sheer audacity of it all. They immediately ordered a court-martial. On August 10th, Captain Lapo was officially charged with violating the Uniform Code of Military Justice. As a direct result of the incident, Strategic Air Command strictly enforced a hard deck. This banned all aircraft from dropping below an altitude of 500 feet. The only thing that saved Lapo from the harshest possible punishment was his stellar service record. He had 28 combat missions under his belt from the Korean War flying the B-29 Superfortress. He also had 4 major combat awards. Additionally, he held a Distinguished Flying Cross for flying highly classified reconnaissance missions over the Soviet Union. To top it off, the pilot had a personal commendation from the legendary General Curtis LeMay. The general once told him, "I really wish I had a whole squadron of pilots just like you." In the end, the court-martial handed down its verdict. The captain was hit with a severe reprimand and slapped with a heavy fine. But the most painful blow for Lapo was not the money, it was being permanently grounded. After that legendary flight under the bridge, he never sat at the controls of a military aircraft ever again.